I kind of gave a little teaser last week that in chapter 3 we would begin looking at one of the things mentioned in the introduction to the book, that of the characteristics of Antichrist that are seen all through history as well as what is recorded in Scripture. And this is what we're going to see as we go into Esther chapter 3. So let's just begin to pick up. We'll kind of take the chapter almost verse by verse, not necessarily so, but almost. After these events, this is New International Version, reading chapter 3, verse 1, King Xerxes honored Hamun, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. So after these events, that phrase that opens this chapter in the first verse really doesn't give us a definite time, but we may be fairly certain that it occurred between the 7th and 12th years of Xerxes' reign, because we'll see in verse 7 that in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, is when Haman started his witchcraft process, idolatrous process of finding out when's the best time to kill all the Jews in the empire. So sometime between the official establishment of Esther as queen, as we saw in chapter 2, in the 7th year of his reign, and now by verse 7, somewhere between the 5th and the 12th year, these events took place, probably toward more the end of the 11th and the 12th, beginning of the 12th year of Xerxes' reign. So after these events, that's kind of the timetable there. And we're introduced in this chapter to really the villain of the book, who is Haman. And a clue is given to us in verse 1 to let us know this man automatically is not going to be good for either Esther or for Mordecai. He's called the son of an Agagite. Now, some commentators will note that this may indicate that Haman was a descendant of King Agag. And you remember King Agag from the reign of Saul. Saul was told by Samuel the prophet to attack the Amalekites and to kill Agag, kill them all, wipe them out. 1 Samuel chapter 15. And Saul failed to do that. He spared the king, and it ended up being Samuel who hacked the king to pieces. And chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, because of that disobedience, really begins the downward spiral of Saul in his life. But the appearance of Haman here is interesting with that phrase being added to him. And we have to all stop and pause for just a moment, because I understand that one of our members has reached a milestone of life that is indicative of, kind of a downward spiral from this point on. Michael Pope has celebrated his 48th birthday. So happy birthday, Michael. And that is courtesy of Brad Sigmund, that we all know that. So
He's got one
in a day or so.
It ain't today, buddy.
It ain't today. Right now, he's still a lot older than you today, right? Yeah.
He's older than me because he was conceived before I was. I just come out over there.
And that is another example of hair splitting that you'll see often by people in life. But we had to rag you a little bit over that, Mike. So, going back to a more serious side of things, Agag, who was an Amalekite, and this is where it gets interesting as we look at Haman in this light of that phrase, son of an Agagite. The Amalekites were descendants of Amalek, who was the son of Eliphaz, who was Esau's firstborn child. Genesis chapter 36, verse 12 and verse 15 gives us this background. And it also tells us that Amalek became a military chief or a leader of a clan of Eliphaz and thus Esau's family. Now, being the child of the firstborn son of Esau, Amalek was well aware, in all probability, of the history between Jacob, Israel, and his grandfather, Esau. Now, the Amalekites lived in the desert south of Canaan, around Kadesh, or the northern part of what is called, if you have maps in the back of your Bible, you'll see an area called the Negev. The Amalekites lived in the northern part of the Negev, which is the desert region that was in the south of Canaan. Now, what makes this interesting about these folks? One, that they were descendants of Esau. But again, the Amalekites were the first group to attack Israel on their journey out of Egypt. Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 16, records the fact that the Amalekites came and they attacked Israel. They were the first ones who did this. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 through 19, in recounting that attack, states that the Amalekites, when they attacked Israel, they attacked from the rear. And they attacked the sick, the aged, and the stragglers, the tired of the population of Israel as they were going through the desert. And it was as a result of that type of attack by people who, had they remembered the promises that had been made to Jacob, who was their family member, that they had nothing to fear out of Israel. Israel wasn't going to take their land. Israel was passing through to enter into Canaan. But because they had rejected the promises, or because of the history, they attacked Israel, the Lord declared in Exodus chapter 17 and Deuteronomy chapter 25 that there would be war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. In other words, this hostility was going to be ongoing. This was indicative. What they did as Israel left Egypt was indicative of how they were going to relate to Israel from generation to generation. And this hostility continued on into the reigns of Saul and David. And it seems that Saul's failure to obey led to the line of Agag and the hatred of Agag to continue against Israel. Now, all of these folks obviously were taken into captivity along with other countries by Assyria and by Babylon. And they assimilated into the empire, and evidently some of them, became very successful, but still held to their heritage. So, as we look at Haman, one of the important things to remember about him is that he's directly linked to Agag. And 1 Samuel 15, and you can put under that Exodus chapter 17, Deuteronomy chapter 25. Haman is a descendant of that group. And as I noted, that one of the themes of Esther is the goal or the characteristics of all the repeating types of Antichrist. And Haman is a picture. He's not the fulfillment, but he is a picture of Antichrist, for he tried to destroy the Jews. Now, let's look at this. Haman is like Antichrist, but there's something else that Scripture talks about that I think we need to look at first. That's the spirit of Antichrist. Now, we have to distinguish between this spirit, this attitude of Antichrist, and the embodiment that will be the physical Antichrist. 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 through 23. 1 John 2. And chapter 4, verses 2 and 3 are the primary texts that we can look at to look at the distinguishment between the spirit of Antichrist and Antichrist. And in that section of Scripture, in those passages, John knows that even now, many Antichrists have come. Even in the first century A.D., there were Antichrists. They were part of the spirit of Antichrist. And John goes on to explain, he really talks about it in chapter 4, that these that are the many Antichrists, even in the first century, were, and they continue to be, those who profess to be a part of the Christian church, the body of Christ, yet in teaching are joined with the liar. Verse 22 of 1 John chapter 2. For they deny that Jesus is the Christ. And John says, anybody who denies that Jesus is the Christ, such a man, I'm quoting, is the Antichrist. He denies the Father and the Son. So this we have to kind of, understand that there's been a spirit of Antichrist at least 2,000 years old. From the very foundations of the establishment of the body of Christ until now, there has been a spirit of Antichrist in the world, denying that Jesus is the Christ. Anybody that we encounter who denies that Jesus is the Christ is actually sharing that spirit that will be embodied personally in the man, Antichrist. So, John goes on to say that this spirit of Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world. So, this spirit of denying Jesus as the Christ and denying the Father and the Son, all of that makes up the spirit of Antichrist. And the singular person of the Antichrist is the ultimate fulfillment of this spirit. So this is then, now, and will continue to be. This will ultimately be fulfilled in the man who will pose himself as the real Messiah of the Jews and will deceive them into believing that at least for 3.5 years before he reveals his true character. And this spirit of Antichrist that is now, there wasn't so much a spirit of Antichrist back then, although you could say so, because Hamun certainly was going to seek to destroy the Jews. The difference is that now in the New Testament, the spirit of Antichrist not only works against the Jew, but works against the believer as well. And Satan's goal is not only to destroy the Jew, but to destroy all of the believers as well. Questions on anything I've said so far?
Well, don't you think now that the spirit, like, not only is it truly their spirit, but there are so many people now that act one way in public and what they really believe, like politicians and like, not to get political, but I think, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist or all that, but a lot of what's going on right now has to do with that spirit, the way people are, the way people they want to be, the power they're fixing to lose.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's interesting, like, to even look at some of this stuff and what's going on.
Oh yeah. We're seeing the spirit of Antichrist almost blooming in our midst today. There's so many, one, that just openly deny Christ and deny the church, deny anything about God. And then there are those who want to manipulate this. In heart, they are here, but in what they talk about, they want us to try to believe that they are really Christ. They are really believers. They are really following the Lord, when all they want to do is deceive us, because here is where their heart is. I mean, I think we're seeing that. It's almost unnerving to see the level of that growing animosity in the world, and in our country in particular, against all that is called God, especially that which is called God through Jesus Christ.
Bill?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
I think the way things are going on right now in this world is they never lost the fear of God. They don't know the
Yeah.
fear of God.
Yeah, that's very true. There is no fear of God because they don't believe there is one. So they've lost the fear of God, and really the only God that they recognize and honor is the one they see when they look in the mirror. That's the only one they honor. And our good buddy Ray Kurzweil, that we've referred to, I do encourage you to read his stuff, even though it may be, some of it may be kind of dated now as far as the technology. It is very relevant as far as what he said. One of the questions that was asked in one of his books was, do you believe in God? And he said, not yet. Because he believes man, through blending with computers, will become God, be able to control the outcome of the entire cosmos. So, you want to talk about megalomania, read his stuff, and you'll see it in a very subtle way. He's not one to jump on top of the table and shout at you. He's not going to do that. But in a very subtle way, he will unnerve you as you read his stuff, because he's dead serious. And as one of the other folks that talk about technological advancements, P.W. Singer says he's one of the good guys. He actually calls him by name and says he's one of the good guys. So if he's one of the good guys, just imagine how much loss of fear of God there is in some of the others that are working on the same type of things that he is. So, any other questions or comments on this? Okay. So as we look at the connection, the spirit of Antichrist, which is in the world today, going back to Hamun being a descendant of Agag, who gives to us characteristics of Antichrist. One of the things that comes out in the life of Hamun, now I'm still in verse 1. We'll see other things unfold as we go through. But one of the first items to consider is that Antichrist will harbor an ancient grievance against God and his Christ and his followers. Now, Haman, what had happened when Israel had come out of Egypt, and what had happened in the reigns of David, Saul, hundreds of years passed since then. From the time they came out of Egypt, maybe even as much as 1,000 years had passed. But Haman still had a grievance against the children of Israel after all that length of time. And it's just interesting. We'll touch on it again. Another thing about Antichrist is that he will not be a person who doesn't know the promises of God. Haman, being a descendant of Agag, going down, who was a descendant of Eliphaz, not the same one in the book of Job, but who was a descendant of Esau, Esau knew the promises. He knew what God had promised Jacob. It had been verified by his father, even though Jacob stole the blessing. He knew what the promises were. And that probably had been passed down, but passed down from the stance of they stole our place. And Antichrist will, in all probability, not be someone who doesn't know about God, but rather he knows and rejects the promises of God with the intent to overthrow them, to destroy them. Antichrist will not be someone who has a relationship with God and then loses it, backslides. he will, from his first connection with the Jewish people, will have as his intent to destroy them and all who follow Christ. Now, a question might come up, will the Antichrist be an Amalekite? Probably not. He's a picture of, he's a type of Haman, but Antichrist will, on all probability, not be an Amalekite. As the genuine Christ came from the line of Judah through David, Antichrist will most likely be a Jew of the line of Judah and may be able to even link his DNA to the line of David. Probably at some point. There will be some bones found that may be purported to be those of David. And through DNA processes, there will be a line established, and the Antichrist will be able to say, I am the Christ because I am of the seed of David, just as Jesus was. So, several early pictures and indications and characteristics of Antichrist. Now, Haman evidently had accomplished something, because verse 1 tells us that King Xerxes honored Haman, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all of the other nobles. So evidently, Haman had accomplished something that so impressed the king that he gave him this seat of elevated honor. Another characteristic, picture of Antichrist, is that Antichrist will be an accomplished person. He will rise to prominence through his abilities, and then when something, for all intents, kills him, he will recover to the wonder of the entire world. And that will finalize the joining of the person with the spirit of Satan. Okay, questions on any of these things that I've... The historical grievance. G-R-I-E-V-A-N-C or E-N-C-E, historical grievance. There is a rejection of promise. He will be accomplished. Yeah. So Haman is like Antichrist in at least these ways. We'll touch on some more as we go on in through the book. Questions, comments on at this point?
Haman also probably knew the promise given to Esau as well, in subordination.
Yeah.
I mean, that grievance, I'm sure, was passed down
Yeah.
to other generations.
Yeah. I think Esau made sure, even though it looked like things were patched up between Jacob and Esau when Jacob came back, that memory, that remembrance continued. Went on through Eliphaz, went on through all the line down to Agag, because Agag was an enemy of Israel. And now, even hundreds of years after that, Haman is called the Agagite. So he is still linking himself culturally to Esau with all of the stuff that Esau passed down about his relationship with Jacob and thus Israel. Yeah. So verse 2. All of the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Now, as part of the elevation of Haman, the king ordered that all of the other royal officials bow down to Haman as an act of deference and borderline worship of Haman. And it's right here that we encounter the problem between the Jewish people and Antichrist / Haman in this case. Mordecai refused to bow. Now it's interesting, commentators will note that bowing before kings and leaders was part and parcel of the custom of that day. And Mordecai surely had been commanded to bow before the king, and evidently he had done so. Or if he had not, it's not recorded, and we don't know that the king knew about this. But when Haman came by, Mordecai made sure that he wasn't going to bow. So what was it about Haman that made Mordecai refuse to bow? And I think verses 3 and 4 give to us an indication of this. Day after day, well, then the royal officials at verse 3 at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. So I think the key in understanding why Mordecai, who in all probability had bowed before the king, refused. He drew the line and said, "No, I'm not bowing to Haman," is because Haman was an Agagite. It goes right back to this line. When he saw who he was, Mordecai knew of the historical enmity between the Amalekites, Agag, their great king, evidently, and the children of Israel. And Mordecai saw through the position of who Haman was to what the man himself was. And it was that understanding that caused him to decide, ain't bending, ain't bowing to this descendant of Esau and Agag. I'm not bowing to him. And you get the feeling from reading these verses that the other officials who did bow were wanting to test Mordecai's stance and maybe even get him removed from his position. Why would they be jealous of that? We don't know, but perhaps, and this is pure speculation, but perhaps they know that Mordecai was the one who revealed the plot to assassinate the king. Remember, there was two very trusted people. They guarded the door to the king's private apartment that were planning on killing Xerxes. And Mordecai heard of it and told Esther, and she told the king, and they were hung. Perhaps these folks who kept coming to Mordecai and finally told Haman, maybe it was some jealousy on their part or so, well, we'll fix you. You ratted out our plan, we'll take care of you. You won't rat out any more plans. We'll tell Haman about you. We don't really know. But for whatever reason, they informed Haman so he would be aware and watch Mordecai. Verses 5 and 6. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So, we again see the wounding of ego. We talked about this earlier as one of the triggers that creates hatred in someone, is that when you wound someone's ego, they want revenge. And certainly verse 5 gives to us what would have been expected from Haman. He was enraged. But by learning that Mordecai was historically a member of the Jewish people, Haman scorned just the idea of getting revenge on Mordecai. And it's here that the proclamation of the Lord through Moses in Exodus chapter 17, where he said from generation to generation there would be animosity, and there would be enmity and hostility. It was here that this comes back into play, and Haman becomes the aggressor, because he's now determined not just to take care of Mordecai. That doesn't nearly satisfy him. He wants to kill all the Jews. Now, some commentators will note that Josephus, in writing his histories, said hatred of the Jews grew out of the destruction of his own race, the Amalekites, by the Jews. That carries us right back to 1 Samuel 15, and later on in the reigns of David, the Amalekites were pretty well subdued. Not totally done away with, but they were subdued. They were all but destroyed by the Jews. And Haman, that continues to carry down that message for all these years. Continued to carry down. And this brings something up that we are encountering it in the 21st century as people right now, almost throughout the whole world, certainly in America. Hatred that comes from a historical context. And it seems that in what is now called the Middle East, memories are very long and fresh. And opportunities for revenge for past hurts are sought and planned through recent perceived indignities. The Muslims are still fighting the Crusades. That's one word. Remember, George Bush used the word about a crusade when he was going against Saddam and invading Iraq. And that just ignited the Muslims. They were thinking back 1,200 years to what happened in the Crusades. And you think, that's been a long time ago. Eventually you would get over it. No, they haven't gotten over it. There is still an enmity against the West, and anybody else for that matter, whom they perceive that has hurt them in the past, and any perceived hurt now. The invasion of Iraq, to use that as an example, or Afghanistan, or whatever, just tends to be linked back to that historic hatred against a person or a people. So this is another element of hatred, remembrance of the past. In other words, not letting something go and holding it in memory to bring up or seek an opportunity to avenge. And we run into this a lot. People not letting go of something.
Don't you think, I'm just curious, don't you think though, that as Americans, and like me, I don't understand what it is.
No,
I have
we don't.
never, if I would have been in Israel when they did all the stuff over there, if I would have been an Israeli, that they rounded up my family and marched them through the streets, I would hate forever. It goes. If I would have been in Hitler's jails and my grandparents, but as an American, unless you're an American Indian, and they don't remember because half of them weren't there, but you have a reason to.
Yeah.
You have no idea.
Or an African American also.
Right, but and true, that is true. So I always have to, even my kids don't get this, and I don't. I have no idea what it's
Most of us
really
don't.
like. And I have trouble understanding that generation passed on war. But I've never had that.
Yeah.
So I just think, while I don't have it, I think maybe we don't understand it.
No, we don't. And I think that's a part of a fault in our foreign policy for a number of years, is that we have failed in whatever we were looking at in particular in the Middle East, that we failed to take into account the history and the culture and how that their memories are very long. They don't forget. It's still very fresh. Now, we in America, we want to move on, as we do. We fought the British. We won. Now we're going to carry on trade. We're going to forget that. We beat them again in the War of 1812, but we're going to keep on. We're going to do it. They don't think like that there. And I don't think we understand that unless we are linked in some personal way to that type of history. We can't even begin to understand, why do they hate us so much now? Why do they hate us now for what happened 1,000 years ago? But that culture It's very ingrained, very tribal, very, very clannish, and memories go very long. And the need to avenge and exact revenge goes on. And we are seeing that today in our world, and not only in the Middle East, you see it in Central Europe, you see it in the Balkan countries, where it's just a powder keg at any point. You remember, Serbia, Kosovo, all that went on? That was this sense of ancient hatred coming back to fore. Now,
Well, they keep teaching. Just keep it fresh.
yeah.
Just the history, and they keep it. In America, a lot of history is lost.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not taught to you, you don't really know what happened.
No.
You really don't. And they keep it, they drive it in.
They drive it in.
Their kids,
Yeah.
They keep it.
They keep it fresh. They keep it fresh. And it's part of how they culturally look at life in general. And, the Lord said in Exodus 17, there will be animosity from generation to generation. This is not going to just go away. And we're seeing it reborn, or reignited in Haman.
We really see it reignited in Mordecai,
Oh, yeah.
because Mordecai was really the one that started it.
Yeah. Mordecai would not back.
And
And-
I get it, and Esau, his lineage is supposed to be subordinate, I get all that. But all Mordecai had to do was bow like he would any other official,
Mhm.
any other official.
All he
And
had to
he's
do
the
was-
one that started it.
Yeah.
So the whole thing really is caused by Mordecai's hatred, if you will,
Yeah.
of Haman.
Yeah. And I think, once again, and that's historical. And he was basing it off of what the Lord had said in Exodus 17 and what had been drilled into him through the years in reading the law. Reading the law, it's in Exodus, it's in the book of Deuteronomy, so it was in the law. This was read. Mordecai would have known about this. So his stance of, I ain't bowing, it ignited the rage of this man.
But was that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well,
Was he supposed to do that and then God had to fix it? Is it just his pride? I mean, which was it?
I think it was probably more of a religious pride. I wouldn't say it was a bad thing that he did. But at the same time, I think it was more of the remembrance of what Agag and the Amalekites had done to Israel. And when there was this Amalekite, a descendant of Agag, actually proclaimed to be a descendant of Agag, walking by and everybody else is bowing, because of all of this, Mordecai said, I ain't doing it. I'm not going to do this. So there was some obstinacy on his part. I would give that. I think it was probably born out of all this history. And he just simply wasn't going to bow.
But what if the time comes and we're called to denounce? First of all, we have to decide.
We have to decide. Yeah. Where is that line? And I think that, it is so important for us to be able to decide that individually. I don't think we can necessarily just throw a blanket over and say, okay, some things, of course, you see this, yes, I'm not going to do it. But on a more individual, day-by-day basis, I think we really do have to decide, okay, where do I bow and where do I not bow? Where do I submit to what society is throwing in my face, and where is it that I say, no, I ain't going to do that. And I ain't going to follow that. And
We're
that's,
supposed to respect those in office.
yeah. And we're going to see, when we get into chapter 4, Mordecai obeying the law, while at the same time wailing and covered in sackcloth and ashes outside the gate. The law of Persia was you can't come into the king's gate in mourning. He didn't do that. And you would think, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but you would think that, if the government just decided to kill all of us Christians, the last thing I'm going to do is worry about obeying their laws. No, Mordecai obeyed the law. I mean, you read it and you almost go, wait, what? Why am I doing that? And we are. We are to be law-abiding even if we are being civilly disobedient, which is what he did in chapter 4. He sat wailing, mourning in sackcloth and ashes, so much so that it got to the attention of Esther. So he was being civilly disobedient in a sense, but at the same time he was obeying the laws. It's going to be an interesting conversation when we get into that a little more deeply. So let's look at this way for Antichrist. What could be Antichrist's reason to, from the beginning, hate the Jew and the believers? Looking at once again, we'll talk about the similarities between Haman and Antichrist is that there is a historical hate. What could be Lucifer's or Satan or Antichrist historical hate?
That's his job. That's what he's supposed to do.
Because he was cast out of heaven to begin with for trying to usurp God. Isaiah 14, very clear on that. That he said, I will ascend to the throne. I will be like the Most High. And it was at that point that who he was as an angel turned into Satan and the enemy of God. And the casting out of Lucifer from heaven and the defeats that Satan has experienced all through history. In Esther's time, it was just the Jewish people that Haman sought to destroy. But now, it will be those who follow Jesus as the Christ of God, as well as the root of the people of God, the Jews. Why will Antichrist have a historical hatred? Because he'd been kicked out of heaven. He had lost every battle he had fought. Job, we just went through Job. He lost that battle. And it just builds that hatred. Everything that he loses in builds and adds on to that which he is not letting go because he can't. And he's going to exhibit that hate against the Jew and against the believer during the tribulation period. But there's something else along this line that as we move into the power, we see the power of community knowledge or culture. And we've talked about that a little bit here. Now, remember, culture is the force of established patterns, thoughts, and ways of living life. That's basically what culture is. Families, clans, tribes, and thus nations have ingrained into them ways of doing things. And it's such a part of who they are, who we are as Americans, that it's just natural to us. Now, one of the downsides to the emphasis on diversity in our world, in my opinion, is that it reawakens old patterns of behavior toward others, often for no other reason than simply for who they are. And one of the things I think needs to be promoted in more of a balance in our world as we talk about diversity is that there needs to be a core that forms the foundation that diverse peoples, that even though they have cultural differences, can live together without trying to kill each other. As we talked about, the Balkans, there were people that before the breakup of Yugoslavia lived as neighbors, but as soon as that broke up, because one was a Muslim, the other was a Serb, for no other reason than that, they started killing each other. For no other reason. Not that they were bad neighbors, it's because of who they were. They killed each other. And I think that there has to be a core that supersedes all of that cultural difference. For believers, it should be a mutual relationship with Jesus Christ. Because we both know Christ, we should be able to get along with people who carry out their life differently than we do. We should be able to do that. And what the world is struggling with now is trying to fit cultural patterns into the laws of the primary country and deciding what that core becomes as the common denominator to link the whole together. What is dividing so much of America is that we emphasize diversity so much that we're beginning to lose what it is that makes us who we are. Instead of Native Americans, we need to be American natives. Instead of African Americans, I think it'd be more, or just as appropriate, to be American Africans. You know, we have a core. We are Americans. This is our country. This is who we are. And I think, you know, the more we leave that sense of who we all are together out, the more we have the little groups, the little enclaves that become the breeding grounds for people like ISIS to go say, well, those people don't like you. They're not like you. And they don't care about you. We do. And people are falling into that line of thought. And I think it's just something we, as Americans, we have to think about. Because we hear diversity till it runs out our ears. But at the same time, there needs to be a core that unites us all together into one person of who we are as a country. That's just a personal opinion. I won't charge any extra for that, you know. But I think Hamun and this cultural emphasis of that history really brings that out. So, good discussion. I've already kept you longer than your time. We'll pick it up next week, and we'll continue this because it continues on as we move on. And we'll see some interesting discussions. So thank you all. Grab something to eat.